Welcome to another episode of the Business Blumin podcast. We have an awesome show today. We have an incredible guest. She's an entrepreneur. She's the one and only founder of LionRun Consulting. She is Nina Raab. Nina, how you doing?
Doing amazing, thank God. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Awesome, and thank you for going on. So Nina's actually a good friend from my time in New York, and she has a really incredible background and incredible company. A lot we'll get into, but just to start off, Nina, can you talk a little bit about your background and kind of your upbringing and what you're up to then?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually originally from Chicago. I went to the University of Illinois and studied finance there. I grew up in kind of a U.S.-Israeli household, kind of going back and forth between the U.S. and Israel throughout my childhood and high school and whatnot. So kind of always had a passion for that side of my identity, but also had a passion for business.
Mhm.
And so that's why I pursued that while I was in college. Um, and so one thing led to another while I was in school, and I can go into a little bit later. But today, I pretty much split my time between New York and Israel, and I founded LionRun Consulting about a year and a half ago, which I can go into again more detail later on.
Awesome, cool. Now we'll definitely get more into that. Really appreciate that. Another thing to get into, and maybe something that led you to eventually starting Line Run. I forget if you mentioned before in our off-air conversations, but something that you were part of, and I was as well, was Tamid when you were in college. So can you speak a little bit about what Tamid is and what your involvement was within that organization?
Yeah, for sure. So, Tamid is an organization that's across college campuses around the country. It allows for U.S. college students to be paired with Israeli startups and essentially do consulting with them on semester-long projects. And then they also have a fellowship program where students can then go to Israel for an 8-week internship and get paired with a company, whether it's a startup or a corporate consulting firm, whatever it is. And you really just get to experience the Israeli ecosystem firsthand. So I got involved in Tamid very early on in college because I knew it was something that I was passionate about, and I saw it as a way to essentially bridge those two ecosystems and build my network in Israel while being here. I was the president of the Illinois chapter, as well as went on the fellowship twice. The first time was remote because of
Mhm.
COVID. So both times I was working at Deloitte. The first summer was on their public sector team. Second summer was on the Catalyst team, which works to bridge multinational companies with Israeli startups. That's kind of where I got into the startup ecosystem and kind of led into what I'm doing today. But also I met my lifelong mentor through Tamid, actually, who then ended up inspiring me to start LionRun.
Got it. Awesome. That's interesting to hear. And another thing to get into. So I, along with you, were actually both Tamid fellows. We both had the privilege of spending a summer in Israel. Personally, the best summer of my life. I'm guessing, if not one of the best, not the best, probably one of the best on your end. But I'd love to know a little bit about more about your time on the fellowship and kind of what you took away most from that experience.
Yeah, so the fellowship was probably it was even though I was working, with startups throughout my time early on to me, but the fellowship was like really an opportunity to get to like be there and experience it essentially firsthand. And also you're in an amazing group of like-minded driven individuals of pretty much like some of the top students around the country, because it's a very competitive program. And so you're not only growing on a professional sense, but also just being in that environment also in Israel and with those types of people is just like an amazing experience.
Yeah, it was definitely the best summer of my life. I could probably say that every day. But to me, if anyone's listening who's involved in to me, definitely try to do the fellowship if you can. Definitely take away from what Nina said and what I've said. Sensational summer, and I'm sure it probably have a big role to do with both of our developments. But really incredible to hear about that. So another thing to get into that you mentioned earlier. Right now, you're running a company called LionRun Consulting. Would love to know about the early stages of LionRun and ultimately how LionRun came to be.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I met a mentor of mine through Tamid. It was pretty early on in my college career. and he would do financial modeling for startups on the side of his private equity job. He was about 3 years out of college or so. And one day he asked me, he was like, "Hey, I know you're super good at PowerPoint. I have all these companies that also need pitch decks. Would you be interested in helping me build some of them out? And I'll essentially pay you on a project basis." So again, kind of being like young, ambitious college student, I said, yeah, for sure. I saw it as an opportunity to learn. One thing led to another. He, kind of went off to do some of his own things as well. And I essentially started referring a lot of the clients to me. And the whole process of like starting to work with different startups allowed me to like really learn about the startup ecosystem, about the VC industry, how startups raise capital, how do they prepare to raise capital, what are investors looking for, and I just kind of became an expert in this little niche. And I also met an amazing guy named Hillel Fold, who has played a tremendous role in the development of LionRun as well, and who I'm also forever grateful for, and has impacted like my business philosophy and what I do today as well. And then it got to a point where I started working on more and more companies, and I was like, this is actually something I can do full time. And that's when I started building out a team, and that was pretty much how LionRun started. And since LionRun's, I guess, official inception, I've worked with over 70 companies. In the last year and a half, pretty much was split between the US and Israel. Not only what's obviously started as like building out pitch decks, but pretty much a whole process of helping companies prepare to raise capital.
Got it. Awesome. It's great to hear. So for those that don't know, I'm fortunate enough to know, not personally, but who Hillel Fold is. Can you speak to briefly about who he is? Some big tech Israeli guy. For those that don't know.
So if you don't know Hillel, you definitely should get to know him. Hillel is obviously from, I guess a professional sense, he is a tech marketer, blogger, journalist, one of the top tech influencers in the world, but primarily focuses kind of on the Israeli ecosystem. But he is really just a tremendous person, and is someone who wants to do nothing but like uplift the Israeli startup ecosystem and see people succeed. So yeah, I met him about 2 years ago, and since then I've had the privilege of getting to work with him very closely, and also him being a close mentor of mine and someone who I greatly respect.
Awesome. It's great to hear. Maybe one day I'll get to know him. He's, from what I understand, he's this big tech guy. Just kind of does a bit of everything. Seems like an awesome individual, and even off air, know how much of an impact he's had on your career. So it seems like he's an awesome person. But another thing, kind of an out of the blue question, and I forgot if you said this before, but how did you come up with the name LionRun specifically?
Yeah. So actually, well, my name is Lavia, and Lavia is lioness in Hebrew. Like that's the translation. So that's where the lion comes from. And then I ran a marathon right before I pretty much incorporated my company. So that's where the run comes from. So, but in general, like I felt like it kind of really embodied like who I am, what I'm trying to do, like kind of like this sense of like strength and like a mix of strengths and spirituality at the same time.
Awesome. So Nina runs a little bit of representing everything. I mean, I think it's a great name, definitely sticks, but hopefully continues to grow. So incredible to hear about that. Something a little more specific to about what you're doing. So as you mentioned earlier, you're working with startup founders all the time, and a lot of times these startup founders want to raise money to grow their company, and you know how that process works. But from your perspective, I would love to know about some of the common struggles that startup founders have when pitching to investors or trying to raise money.
Yeah, so I mean, when pitching to investors, the most common struggle I see is just overcomplication of their company, and what their solution is. Like you can be in a meeting, let's say with an investor or whoever it is, and like or sometimes I'm in a meeting with a client. I'm like, okay, explain to me your business. And an hour goes by and I could still fully not understand what they're doing.
Mhm.
And that's like the number, and you would think it's such a basic thing, but it really is a struggle. For when you're building a business, you're ingrained in the everyday and you see every little nuance of your company and you feel like you need to explain all of it, but you really don't.
Mhm.
You should be taking more of like a high level approach. And pretty much what I tell founders is explain it to me or explain it to an investor the way that you would explain to your grandma.
It's a
Simplify,
great
simplify, simplify.
So it's a great way of looking at it. When I was like way back when, not to get too into the weeds, but when I was trying to get a job in banking, I think one of the most frequent questions I was like, how do you explain investment banking to like two? I think the same could be said for how to pitch your company. I think a lot of times, like you said, investors may be really in the weeds, but realistically, people just want a solution to a problem, which I think ultimately can get bogged down. I think it's really cool work that you're helping them maybe where they initially started, but somehow that gets lost in the day to day. So it's really awesome that you're really helping them refine that and ultimately pitch that in an eloquent way and hopefully help them raise money. But it's an
Yeah.
incredible way of looking at it. Another thing.
Also,
Sure.
oh, go ahead. No, I
No,
was
no,
gonna
no.
say, I was just gonna say when if there are like the main things to incorporate, like, or the main takeaways that you should leave, let's say an investor when you're speaking to them. Usually, it's your problem, solution, your team, which is essentially explaining like why us, and then the why now, which is opportunity, and then pretty much what is your path to X million ARR, because that's a return side of it. But yeah.
Got it. Awesome. No, I really, really appreciate you sharing that. I think, a lot of times it might be a great foundation for how I mean, hopefully they go to you and you get more clients, but that may be a great way of how, people can really simplify or founders can really simplify pitching to investors. But really appreciate that advice. On a higher level, kind of anything that you just said, is there any other advice you have for founders who are looking to fundraise or who may have trouble fundraising other than, going to LionRun Consulting as an obvious one?
Um, I mean, right now it's definitely like a more difficult time to raise than it was, let's say, 2 years ago.
Sure.
But it's a process.
Mhm.
You don't just wake up one day and you have a list of people you're going to reach out to, and they're all going to say yes. It's essentially a game of relationship building
Mhm.
that sometimes lasts, let's say, 6 months. There's not really a set timeline to it, but developing those relationships, keeping people updated on what you're doing, sending follow-ups, um, and developing this like essentially system or process early on, even if you're not ready to raise yet, is so important. So then once you get to the point where you feel like you have those relationships developed, and it's just a matter of tapping into those.
Got it. So your suggestion would be for folks or just entrepreneurs in general who are looking to raise money eventually, but aren't really doing that right now. If they might be in the beginning stages of scaling their company, would be to just have those initial conversations and build those relationships with investors. So when it comes time to fundraise, maybe there's a little more credibility involved. Do you think that's great advice?
Yeah, and it could be simply as like, let's say, people in your network who potentially could become investors.
Mhm.
Um, and you say, hey, I just want to get your opinion on something. I would love your feedback. I respect your opinion. Would you mind hopping on a quick call just to see what I'm building?
Mhm.
Something simple as that.
Got it. I think a lot of times people can get really, they can get so much in the weeds that they forget like that the simple things are really what works. So I think it's good to remind folks every once in a while to maintain those relationships and not to burn bridges because you don't know. Well, not to get too far into that weed, but always maintain that relationships with anyone, maybe especially folks who you think can become investors because they may be able to help you a bit in the short run, but then in the long run, when you do need to raise capital, they can be a go-to contact. So I think that's also a great way of looking at it. So the other thing I wanted to get into, kind of a high level about LionRun. So you've been running LionRun about now for like 2.5 years, right?
about.
So I'm sure you've probably gotten this question before, but right now, where do you see LionRun going in the next 5 to 10 years, or are you just taking it kind of day by day or year by year right now?
It's a very difficult question because I
Yeah.
think about like where I was at a year ago, and it's even way different than where I'm at today. Because it's constantly growing, things are evolving. The way I'm spending my time today is not how I was spending my time a year ago. Thank
Mhm.
God now I brought people on full time to help me. And the types of opportunities just continue to evolve
Mhm.
as I've built up this brand, this reputation, and essentially a track record. Um, so it's, this essentially the sky is the limit to where it could potentially go.
Mhm.
As long as I kind of keep staying on this path, and staying consistent.
Mhm.
Essentially, I like in my opinion, the path to success is really consistency. It's a mix of consistency and perseverance. Because you have to keep pushing, but you have to be consistent with what you're doing.
Got it. So it's almost like just accepting, or it's going to sound really contradicting or oxymoronic, but accepting that a lot of times running your own thing can be a little chaotic, and being at peace with that, and just being committed to figuring out. So I really like that you're kind of focused on, you really reminisce of where you used to be and how far you've come, and you're just taking it kind of year by year, and then wherever it goes is wherever it goes. But you're kind of just along for this incredible journey. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean that's it's pretty spot on. Like entrepreneurship is kind of it has its ups and downs, but um, also actually I will say one thing. One of the biggest, I think, things that have impacted my my growth, like through with LionRun, has been the ability to like be comfortable with uncomfort and essentially putting myself out there, whether it's posting on LinkedIn more than like I probably would have expected, early on. Um, Going to certain events and doing speaking events, it all intertwines with this essentially personal slash professional brand. Um, and that has played a huge role in, I guess, the growth of the company.
Got it. So would you say that without LimeRun, you don't think you'd be kind of as active on social media, or maybe not even social media, but as active going into these other events, like really putting yourself out there? So one thing you're kind of grateful for is that entrepreneurship is literally, no pun intended, would push you to like kind of think outside the box and like really go out there and put yourself out there.
100%. And that's what I love about it is like
Also,
you never know what's going to come next or what's the new next the next opportunity that's going to come. Um, and like I find those different events or whatever it is, that's what keeps life exciting.
got it. Awesome. That's great. Well, wonderful to hear, and incredible that this idea in entrepreneurship, where obviously there's the ups and downs, but you're kind of just accepting it and then just going along for the journey. I think a lot of times when folks, or I don't know why I keep saying folks, but when entrepreneurs just accept that mindset, that tends to be when they really take off and kind of go into success. But it's incredible to hear. Just to get into the last few things I wanted to ask about here. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that you're right now frequently between New York and Israel, unsurprisingly, two both really big startup ecosystems, emphasis on Israel. But basically, we'd love to know what it's like just always constantly being between the two. Do you love it? Is it stressful at times? Would love to know a bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like I was kind of what my dad likes to say, a hybrid, where you kind of have these two identities, but you want to take advantage of the best of both. And so
Mhm.
that's really what I've been trying to do. Um, and definitely it gets exhausting at times,
Mhm.
going back and forth and the travel. Um, but when you have, I think, you know, people and a place also that you love, it just makes it, and essentially also a type of work that you also love, it definitely makes it definitely better. And yeah, like pretty much like my dad's side of the family's in Israel. My brother is also in the army. And so, but also the other half of my family's in the US. So, you know, it's kind of a little bit of the best of both. And I guess we'll see, taking it day by day.
We'll see. Okay, awesome. Sounds good. Quick, random question on that. Do you ever see yourself reincorporating in Israel, or right now that's kind of too far in the future?
For me, the angle is to be in Israel.
Got it. Awesome.
Yeah.
No, cool to hear. Appreciate that. And another thing I wanted to get into, one of the parting notes. So you mentioned earlier that you had a lot of mentors that are really central to your growth. Kind of, is there anything that you could speak to specifically and kind of discuss what the role they played in your development and also kind of the development in LionRun?
Yeah, I mean, I got thrown into something where like it was a figure it out mentality. That's really what drove me and like what I had to do. So having those trusted people that you could go to and just run ideas off of, like otherwise, entrepreneurship, it's a very lonely thing. Like otherwise, like, it's very easy to get caught up in your own head. And being indecisive about things, that if you just get someone's opinion, they can help you make a decision a lot faster. So that always helped, because a lot of the things I'm doing, like, you don't learn in school. You don't learn the nuances of like, how to write a proposal for a specific client, or how to deal with like abnormal client relationships, or yeah, like essentially how to run a business. Like you don't learn that in school. It's pretty much you being able to rely on people who have like done similar things has been really crucial. And has kind of been my own version of school, being able to tap into those mentors.
Got it. I think it's an awesome way of looking at it. When a lot of entrepreneurs, like, I didn't learn this in school. You kind of learn it on the spot, and I think a lot of things you kind of just learn on the spot. So it's interesting to hear that, but really incredible to hear that. Have an awesome story, kind of being in between or having a family ties to both the U.S. and Israel, growing up in Chicago, then being involved in me, going on the fellowship, starting LionRun, and then kind of growing it into this behemoth of being able to work with a lot of startups and helping them raise capital. Aside from that, in your personal life, I'd love to know kind of what brings you happiness or how you're able to find happiness.
Yeah, I mean, I think being surrounded by like amazing people is just like the most important thing in life.
The Upper East.
And what?
I was like, sorry, I was saying shout out to the Upper East Side.
Yeah, so I mean, being in a strong community, it really like having people to rely on. Like work is all fun, but if you don't have people to share the success with, then it's like, what are you doing it for? So it's kind of a mix of that. Being with family, like some of my hobbies. I mean, like I'm a runner. Like being able to also like working out and keeping a healthy body and lifestyle is also so important, because if you don't have a healthy lifestyle, then you can't be you can't sustain like the grind the grind of life, essentially. So yeah.
Got it. So it's like accepting, similar to what we said earlier, accepting that entrepreneurship is just, it's always constant chaos, and doing your best to just find the time to spend time with family, friends, and kind of sustain a healthy lifestyle as much as you can.
Definitely. And you definitely still have to prioritize yourself, in many cases. Like there were definitely times, like at the beginning, every other person's time is more valuable, or you prioritize everyone else's time over yours. But after a while, then you start to value your time and like set certain boundaries, because you could work forever as an entrepreneur. Like it doesn't end. So finding that balance is super important.
I think that's really interesting. On a quick follow-on question to that, on a similar note, do you think, like, because the way I've been thinking about entrepreneurship too, and I'm certainly in like the beginning stages of what I'm doing, but do you often see it as like, when you're starting out, you start to realize that the to-do list is never ending. I mean, it just grows and grows and grows every day. So do you think that a good practice for someone getting into entrepreneurship or after they've been involved for a little bit is to just kind of have a gut feeling or take a mental note of like, there's a certain time or like, if, putting their foot down if there's, or like getting a vibe of like when their day should be over? I don't know the best way to ask that question, but do you kind of see where I'm getting at? Like to know when I'll put that off to tomorrow if it's not urgent. I don't have to do something today that's due in like 3 weeks from now.
Um, yeah, I mean, at first I used to have the mentality of like get as much done as possible today because, not necessarily like, oh, there's no tomorrow, but it was kind of, I always felt this like sense of urgency.
Mhm.
But then you realize like, okay, what's the worst that can happen if you send the email in the morning versus at, like 8 a.m. versus stay up an extra 10 minutes at 2 a.m. when you're like half asleep. Um, so yeah, you kind of just have to set those boundaries for yourself, and over time you kind of you become like okay with like it doesn't like stress you out. I think, at least for me, like now it's just like a normal thing to have everything on your to-do list. You just have to break it down as
Makes
in
sense.
small tasks.
It's almost like, over in the beginning, I think it's for a lot of entrepreneurs, it's a struggle, and I'm sure it was for yourself. But over time, you kind of get a good sense of like what has to be done versus like, what doesn't have to be done at 2 a.m. It doesn't make a
Yeah,
difference in that, right? Okay,
exactly.
awesome.
Also, I think the biggest thing for me also is keeping Shabbat is super important.
It's
Like
incredible.
logging off for 25 hours, like I would recommend for everyone to do it for your own well-being. Um, and however, in whatever way that is for other people as well. But it's, it's essentially like how I've been able to like structure my week and be able to like, I guess,
Maintain
push
sanity.
myself more. Yeah.
Got it. Maintain sanity and put yourself more. I
Yeah.
guess both of. So quick, quick follow to that. Did you always keep Shabbat, or did you just start recently, kind of when you were doing this business thing as one a way to connect to your Judaism more, but also as like this is like off time. This is like log off time.
No, so I started keeping Shabbat about, almost 3 years ago now. Actually, while I was in college, like I grew up in a traditional household. Um,
Mhm.
and it wasn't until I really got to college where I felt like this is something that like I wanted to do. I thought it like brought a sense of like grounding and like something to hold me to my identity. And when you're in a university setting, which is where a lot of people can get lost and lose their identity. So that's kind of how it started, and I've never really looked back.
No, that's great to hear. On like a personal note or something I've observed is like a lot of individuals growing up, may keep Shabbat, but may not view it as like this, really sacred, great day for just taking a break. Then as you get older, and especially for entrepreneurs, as you get really, really busy, you might appreciate Shabbat much, much more because it's like almost a mandatory like shut off, spend time with your friends, family, do your thing. So it's an incredibly beautiful thing. So really great to hear on that. And kind of one last thing I wanted to get into, is there anything else that you want to share, want people to know, whether it's business advice, life advice, happiness advice, stage is yours.
um, Let me think about that one. There's a few things, and I could go on talk about this probably forever. Um, like one thing that I think that has propelled me forward in my entrepreneurial journey is just like having a mindset of there's nothing that you can't learn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because if you have this mindset of like essentially it's kind of like a you can do anything, like it's a self-confident, like if you don't believe in yourself and like what you can do and like what you can learn, like no one else is going to, especially like in the type of work that I'm doing, like I'm like you can't how do you convince someone else that you can do something for them and do
Mm-hmm.
it very, very well if you don't believe it yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for anyone, like people who are in corporate jobs who are looking to try and like get out and like do something more entrepreneurial, but they're like, well, how do I don't have these skills. I don't know how to do this or this. Like, there's no better time where to like essentially do something that you're passionate about because there's just so many resources and like ways to learn. So yeah, I guess that's one piece of advice, but there's a lot of other pieces as well.
No worries. Maybe if I get to, I think this is like episode number 8 or 9 for me. Maybe if I get to episode 109, maybe we could have you back on and we can do a whole segment on advice for entrepreneurs. But I really appreciate that advice. So really having that confidence or that mental switch that you can learn anything and hitting the ground running, and that there's no time like the present. But overall, Nina, you have a really incredible story, a really awesome company. Wish you nothing but continued success, and want to say thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the Business Blumin podcast.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniel, for having me. It's a pleasure.